Well, Denver, I don't know if you spoke on that intentionally today about suffering and sacrifice, but that's a perfect setting of the table for the text we're going to be looking at today in Revelation chapter 2. So I'd invite you to be turning there this morning. As you're doing that, I want to thank Mike for filling in for me last week. Beverly and I were in Clovis, New Mexico doing a grief workshop for a church where a friend of mine preaches, and had a good time there, but as always, it was great to drive back into Decatur last Sunday night. And I thank Mike so much for both teaching class and preaching for me last week. Clarence Jordan was the author of the Cabbage Patch the Cotton Patch New Testament back in the 60s. Oh, that brings all kinds of images into my head. And he was also the founder of the interracial Koinonia Farm in Americus, Georgia. And he was instrumental in beginning the Habitat for Humanity. And one day back in the 60s, he went to visit a preacher friend of his who wanted to show him their new church building. And with pride, the minister pointed out the rich, imported pews and the luxurious decorations. And they stepped outside, and he pointed out that up on top of the steeple was a huge cross. Now, this is in the 1960s, and he said that cross cost us $10,000. To which Jordan said, "You got cheated. Times were when Christians could get a cross for free." And what he meant was that they could be martyred. It's been estimated that about 160,000 Christians are martyred every year because of their faith. That over the last 2,000 years, there have been approximately 7 million Christians who have lost their lives because of their faith. And there's a Christian mission agency in Southern Asia that tries not to call attention to themselves because the countries in which they serve are very hostile to the Christian faith. And so part of their process of discipling in those countries is to prepare converts for living life for Jesus when they very likely might be persecuted for it. And so as they work among the poor people in these villages, when they hear about somebody who has decided that they want to be baptized, they will ask them 7 questions. And here they are. Are you willing to leave home and lose the blessing of your father? Second, are you willing to lose your job? Third, are you willing to forgive those who persecute you and go to them with the message of Jesus? Fourth, are you willing to give an offering to the Lord? Fifth, are you willing to be beaten rather than to deny your faith? Sixth, are you willing to go to prison? Seventh, are you willing to die for Jesus? And if they agree to those 7 things, they then sign a piece of paper that says that of their free will, they are choosing to give their lives to Jesus. Now, if they're caught with that piece of paper, they're sent to prison for 3 years. If the person who is teaching them is caught, that person's sent to prison for 6 years. On a totally, something happened when I stepped away a second ago. It's on. Okay. One's baptism would take on a totally new meaning if we lived in a culture that encourages the persecution of Christians, wouldn't it? And as I study the book of Revelation, I'm convinced that
where we live, the culture in which we live, has a lot to do with how we read it. Revelation was written to people who lived in a culture that encouraged persecution. And as John writes to these 7 churches, actually he's writing what Jesus is saying to these 7 churches. He knows what they face. Because Emperor Domitian has done something that no prior emperor had ever done. He pronounces that he is a god before he died. And every citizen was expected to take a pinch of incense and put it on an altar in the presence of Roman officials and say, Caesar is Lord. And so the church has 2 choices. Either they can say, no, I have only one Lord and his name is Jesus, and suffer persecution. Or secondly, they can practice accommodation. Just go along to get along. And the church that we're going to read about today chose the first option. And Jesus commends them for choosing what is best. We're in chapter 2 and verse 8. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you're rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Whoever has ears, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. The ruins of Smyrna are within the present-day city of Izmir, Turkey. In fact, you can see there's the ruins, and all around is the city. It's a city of about 4 million people, predominantly Muslims. About 35 miles due north of Ephesus, which we looked at the letter to Ephesus 2 weeks ago. Cicero once called Smyrna one of Rome's most faithful allies. And for good reason. 3 centuries before Revelation was written, Smyrna was the first city in the world to dedicate a temple to the goddess Roma. They had cast their lot with Rome before Rome was the world power that it became. And so when the edict came down saying that you had to proclaim Caesar as Lord, the people in Smyrna lined up. But not all of them. Some Christians paid the price. And yet, sometimes paying the price means gaining more. Jesus said there in verse 9, I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. You see, for a number of years, Rome didn't know for sure what to do with Christians. Because early on, they considered Christians to just be an offshoot of Judaism. And Judaism was an official religion of the Roman Empire. They were legally sanctioned. They didn't have to do everything that the other religions within the Roman Empire had to do, because the Jews were known for stirring things up if they were told they couldn't do certain things. But as we see develop in the book of Acts, early on, as the impact of Christianity expanded into the Roman Empire, the Jews constantly were stirring up the Gentiles against Christians. And they accused them of worshiping a criminal who had been put to death by Rome. And they misrepresented the Lord's Supper and said these Christians are cannibals. They're eating human flesh and drinking human blood. And so Jesus made a bold assessment here at the end of verse 9 when he says, I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Now, Jesus isn't suggesting that these Jews were literally worshiping Satan. Rather, he's saying that Satan was using the Jewish religion to bring persecution to the Christians. By the way, might I say, Satan loves to use religion to oppose what God's doing in our world. And we're seeing it today. And so the pressure that was being brought upon this church in Smyrna was having serious economic consequences for its members. Jesus says that he knew about their poverty. There's two Greek words that are translated poverty. One of them is the idea of being needy, of living hand to mouth, of barely getting by, but getting by. And then there's another word, and it's the word that Jesus uses here. It's the word that means abject poverty. It means absolutely destitute. And he recognizes that that's where these people are living. Historians tell us that they were victims of job discrimination. They were victims of business boycotts and sanctioned looting. Can I tell you, the prosperity gospel would not have gone over in Smyrna. Poverty and affliction. That's what these Christians were experiencing. And so I want you to imagine with me that you were a Christian living in Smyrna in the first century. And you get word that there is a letter from Jesus that is going to be read to you next Sunday. And you can't wait to get to church to hear it. Because you're tired of living in poverty and you're tired of bearing affliction. And so you gather in your faith community that Sunday with great anticipation. And here's what you're told. Hang on, because it's about to get worse. Verse 10, Jesus says, do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Understand, in the ancient world, prison was a prelude to death. Now, imagine with me, back to that illustration. You're a young man or a young woman, and you're there hearing that letter read. You've lost your job. You feel like you're being tailed by Roman officials everywhere you go. And you've got a baby that's sitting on your knee. And this letter is read in your hearing in church, and the letter says, hang on, it's about to get worse. What's the first thing that's going to go through your mind? Fear? Did you know that do not fear is the most common command in Scripture? But if you have ever been afraid, can I tell you, you're in good company. Because God told Abraham, do not fear. And God told Isaac, do not fear. And He told Jacob, do not fear. And He told Moses 3 times, do not fear. He told Joshua 3 times. He told Jeremiah and Elijah and Ezekiel and Daniel. We come to the New Testament. Paul had to be told 2 times, do not fear. And Jesus told His disciples 10 times, do not fear. Listen, in the Bible, fear isn't conquered by us changing our circumstances. Fear is conquered by changing our perspective. And so Jesus says to this church, I know what you're going through. You're poor, and yet you're rich. What? In Hebrews chapter 10, in verse 32. Listen to what it says listen to what he said to these struggling Christians. He says, "Remember those early days after you had received the light, when you endured in a great conflict full of suffering? Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property, because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions." So you see, even though these people in the church at Smyrna appeared to be poor, they knew that they had something valuable that could never be taken away, because they had invested in Jesus. Jesus' message to them is, don't focus on what can be taken from your hands. Focus on the one in whose hands you are held, from whom you cannot be taken. Because you can lose your job, and you can lose your stuff, and you can lose your reputation, and you can lose your life. But if you have Jesus as your Lord, you can't lose. Now, as I told you, to each one of these letters that are written, these 7 churches, Jesus' statement begins with a reference back to what happened in chapter 1 when he appeared to John. And what he says to this church at Smyrna is this. It comes from chapter 1 and verse 17, but he says it in verse 8. "I am the first and the last." In other words, I think to their specific situation, Jesus is saying, I was before you begin experiencing troubles and tribulation, and I will be after your troubles and tribulation are over. And if you believe that, you gain a new perspective that will conquer fear. Jesus once said this to his disciples, Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28. He said, "Do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell." So what is he saying to this church in Smyrna is this: don't fear the first death. What you need to be concerned about is the second death. And in the book of Revelation, the second death is the lake of fire. Now, I know in 2013 in America, it's not proper to talk about hell anymore. And preachers are sometimes labeled for talking about hell. And while I don't want to be guilty of emphasizing hell more than Jesus did, can I tell you that there's no one in the Bible that talked more about hell than Jesus did? And Jesus said, are you listening? Jesus said there is a second death. And the one who overcomes and invests in Jesus is not going to be hurt by the second death. Why? Because these are the words of him who died and came to life again, he says in verse 8. And these Smyrna Christians are rich because they've invested in Jesus. They're investing in an account that pays huge dividends and pays huge hope benefits. Jesus faced every affliction that this church in Smyrna faced. And he dealt the enemy a fatal blow. Yes, the enemy put him to death, but the tomb is empty. And trust in the tomb being empty will fill your hope tank. And can I tell you this? You can't intimidate people whose hope tanks are full. And so in Hebrews 11 and verse 35, The writer of Hebrews says there are others who were tortured. And I read that and I just think, I'm not even worthy to be reading that. I've whined in my life because I've been slandered by people because of things I've preached. And those were Christians. There are others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. And so Jesus tells this church at Smyrna, for 10 days you may have to suffer persecution. And that 10 days isn't literal. But what it represents is Jesus is saying it's going to last a while, but it's going to have an end. There's going to be a period that you're going to suffer persecution. But he tells them that if they endure their crown of suffering, that they're going to receive an eternal crown. Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 17, and he's just listed some things that are hardly light and momentary, but he says, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Listen, this is tough, but we need to hear this. Persecution will reveal how much a church really believes in the empty tomb. Persecution will reveal how much people really believe in the resurrection. A few years after this letter was written, fierce persecution broke out in pockets of the Roman Empire. And one of those places was in North Africa. And there were some Christians in North Africa that chose accommodation rather than persecution. And they tried to justify it to Tertullian, who was an early church leader in the city of Carthage. What they said to Tertullian was, after all, we have to live. Tertullian said, must we live? You know, I can't find anywhere where Jesus ever told anybody that they have to live. What Jesus told people is you have to be faithful. And for 2,000 years, many people have, to the point of death. And I want to tell you about one of them right now. When the grandfather of the current leader of North Korea, whose name was Kim Il-sung, came into power back in the 1950s, persecution against Christians became intense. There is a story about on one occasion, the North Korean army went into a small village and they found where some people had hidden some Bibles and things in the wall of their house. And so they took those people, 25 of them. They took them out to a street and they tied the 5 leaders of this group hand and foot and laid them in the street. And then they ran over them with bulldozers while everybody else watched, and they paved the street over them. Well, it's estimated that there's about 250,000 believers in North Korea today, despite continued ruthless opposition. But there's a man, and very few people even know his name. He's known as the Traveler. And this man sneaks into the country, and he takes Bibles and he takes commentaries to these little villages where there's pockets of Christians meeting in secret. And he knows that when he gets caught, that he's going to be executed. But he just keeps going back. This text really gets me, because I don't really know how to make application to my own life, or much less to yours, as Christians living in America in 2013. The complaints I have heard from Christians today would never even appear in the thoughts of these people. Someday, think about this. Someday we're going to be in heaven visiting with people from all the ages. And I just kind of picture, here's these Smyrnan Christians who come around me, and maybe even the traveler. And they're telling me about what they risked for Jesus. What am I going to say? You think you've got it bad? There was this July day a few years ago when one of the air conditioning units in our auditorium went out, and it got up to 82 degrees. And when it rains, which is very rarely, but when it rains, we had to walk all the way from the parking lot into the building. And so some of us chose not to come on those days. Really, how do we in our culture, in our context, relate to this kind of discipleship? I would like to believe that if I lived in a part of our world where it is dangerous and deadly to be a Christian, that I would do so faithfully. Who knows? Maybe that day's coming. Things have changed a lot in this country in my lifetime. And I don't want to be an alarmist, but I can see a day coming where, for my grandchildren, it might be illegal for them to say that marriage is to be between a man and a woman. And I can already see in some places where you can be accused of hate speech if you say that Jesus is the only way to the Father. And there's a part of me that fears that day, and there's a part of me that thinks it might be the best thing that could happen for Christians. Because it would reveal who really believes in the empty tomb and who's just playing at religion. It would purify the church of pretenders. I really want us to think about this morning. How would I respond if my culture becomes even more hostile to me because of my faith? And to be honest, I think that day's coming. And so the question is, as our culture applies more pressure on us, what's going to come out of us? Because concealed loyalty is an oxymoron, right? Beverly has a fundraiser usually once a year for her nonprofit counseling service. Can you imagine if on the night of that fundraiser, Beverly said to me, "Rick, tonight would you just don't stand by me and just act like you don't know me?" I wouldn't be very honored by that. Concealed loyalty is a contradiction. Jesus is Lord. And that conviction might mean, brothers and sisters, that someday we could lose our lives. But even if that doesn't happen, at the very least, it means that we are to choose to live every day of our lives grinding it out in daily faithfulness. And so Jesus said, "Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Now, depending upon how one dates Revelation, within 50 to 60 years of these words being spoken to this church, there was at least one example of it being fulfilled. It was in AD 155. Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna, this very city. And he had actually been a disciple of the Apostle John. Can you imagine? This guy sat at the feet of John. And he's 86 years old now. And he's arrested on the charge of atheism. Now, understand, under the Roman Empire, atheism meant that you would not say Caesar is Lord. And so the Roman proconsul said to him, I have respect for your age. Simply say, away with the atheist and I'll set you free. Polycarp looked out at the crowd that had gathered to watch him be persecuted, and he said, away with the atheists. And when asked why he was being so obstinate in the face of death, Polycarp said, 86 years I have served him, and he has never done me wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? And at that, this 86-year-old man was burned at the stake. I don't want you to feel pity for him. And I don't want you to feel pity for the traveler. Because sometimes poor is more. And Jesus said in verse 11, the one who is victorious will not be hurt by the second death. Oh, I hope you're in Jesus today. And if you're not, you could make a decision to come do that today, to come and confess Him as Lord of your life and be baptized into Christ, something that every one of us would love to witness this day. If you're in need of prayer, we encourage you to come. If it's something that's more personal that you don't want to share in a public way, if you'll make your way to room 102 right now, there'll be an elder and his wife who will pray with you. Let me encourage you to come as we stand and sing.